What if I told you that stupidity isn't about IQ? That it isn't just ignorance or being uninformed or not knowing better? What if I told you that stupidity, real stupidity, the kind that destroys societies and collapses democracies, is something far more dangerous, something contagious, something that spreads not through genetics or education, but through obedience, through conformity, through the slow erosion of thought? Now picture this. A brilliant scientist starts sharing misinformation. A loving mother begins following dangerous medical advice. A compassionate teacher starts preaching hate. These aren't villains. They're not evil. They're you. They're me. They're people who for just a moment stopped thinking and handed their judgment over to someone else. And that right there is the terrifying core of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity. Bonhoeffer wasn't a philosopher in an ivory tower. He wasn't writing theory for the sake of theory. He was writing from a Nazi prison cell in 1943, watching his country destroy itself from the inside. He had witnessed what few dared to admit. The collapse of reason doesn't begin with ignorance. It begins with surrender. You see, Bonhoeffer understood something we're still struggling to admit today. Evil is loud, obvious. Eventually, it burns itself out. But stupidity. Stupidity walks through the front door dressed like virtue. It smiles, it votes, it reposts, it teaches Sunday school. It wears a lab coat or a police badge or a priest's collar, and it believes it's doing good. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because stupidity in Bonhoeffer's eyes wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was the abdication of responsibility. It was what happened when people stopped being human and became echoes. Echoes of slogans, of fear, of whatever voice happened to shout the loudest. Let me ask you something. Have you ever believed something just because everyone else did? Have you ever caught yourself repeating a phrase without fully knowing what it meant? Have you ever hesitated to ask a hard question because silence felt safer? That's where it starts. In 1961, long after Bonhoeffer had been executed, a man named Stanley Milgram ran an experiment at Yale. Volunteers were told to administer electric shocks to strangers. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. And when instructed by a man in a lab coat, 65% of them delivered what they believed were lethal shocks. 65%. Normal people, not monsters, just obedient, just scared, just unwilling to disobey. Bonhoeffer saw that same obedience in 1930s Germany, in priests who blessed genocide, in scholars who justified tyranny, in neighbors who turned on neighbors. And he understood something we forget far too often. Stupidity isn't passive. It's an active force, a refusal to think, a moral failure disguised as neutrality. He wrote, "Against stupidity we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears." He wasn't being poetic. He was being precise. Because when someone has stopped thinking, truly stopped thinking, you can't argue with them. Logic slides off. Facts get twisted. The truth sounds like an attack. And worse, they don't know it's happening. They feel smart. They feel righteous. And they'll defend their delusion like it's their soul. But Bonhoeffer didn't just diagnose the disease. He named the cure. And it wasn't more facts. It wasn't yelling louder. It was courage. The courage to think, to stay uncomfortable, to hold space for doubt, to walk away from the crowd and say, "I don't know, but I'm willing to learn." This podcast is going to walk you through Bonhoeffer's theory step by step. It's going to hurt. It's going to challenge. It's going to force you to confront not just the world but yourself. And that's a good thing. Because the only thing more terrifying than stupidity is pretending we're immune to it. To understand the gravity of Bonhoeffer's warning, we have to go deeper into the mind of the man who lived through one of history's darkest descents, and still dared to ask the hardest questions. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't merely a witness to Nazi Germany. He was a resistor, a pastor, and a man who paid for his defiance with his life. But what haunted him more than the evil he saw was the apathy. The ease with which good, moral, intelligent people handed over their minds in the name of convenience, tradition, or fear. He came from a family of thinkers. His father was a prominent psychiatrist. His brothers were scholars. Bonhoeffer believed in reason, in discourse, in the power of education. But as the Third Reich tightened its grip, he watched professors quote Hitler with reverence, priests replace scripture with slogans, and neighbors become informants. It wasn't ignorance. It was intellectual surrender. A willingness to not think, because thinking had become dangerous. He wrote from his prison cell, "The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn, must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like, that have taken possession of him. What Bonhoeffer understood is that stupidity is not an individual defect, it's a collective disease. It's not caused by lack of intelligence but by social pressure. It doesn't thrive in solitude, it needs a crowd. And the terrifying truth: the more powerful the movement, the easier it becomes to shut your brain off and follow. We've seen it happen again and again. The Red Scare, the Salem witch trials, cults, repressive regimes, conspiracy spirals online. Time and again, decent people become carriers of destruction, not through malice, but through moral laziness. In our modern world, the battlefield isn't a trench, it's a timeline. It's your newsfeed. It's the dinner table. It's the moment you read a headline and share it without checking. It's the moment you hear something that feels good and stop asking if it's true. Bonhoeffer knew this all too well. He saw how fast truth was replaced with narrative, how quickly slogans replaced questions. And he realized if the human mind can be hijacked by pressure, then the greatest form of resistance isn't protest, it's critical thought. Not loud, not viral, but quiet, tireless, relentless. He called this kind of resistance costly grace. The grace that doesn't come cheap. The grace that doesn't offer easy answers. The grace that says, I will think even when thinking costs me. I will question even when it makes me an outcast. I will not surrender my mind just to feel safe. And we have to ask ourselves, have we surrendered already? When was the last time you changed your mind about something that mattered? When was the last time you were willing to be wrong, or to be the only one not clapping in the room? Bonhoeffer believed the only cure for stupidity was responsibility. Radical, uncomfortable responsibility. Not just for your actions, but for your thoughts, your silence, your complicity. He once asked a question that echoes into our age: who stands fast? When the entire world is leaning into conformity, who will think? Who will refuse the easy answer? Who will look in the mirror and say, I won't become an echo even if it costs me everything? And that question, it's no longer theoretical. It's at your doorstep, on your screen, in your voice. The first resistance to stupidity isn't revolution, it's self-examination. And the time to start is now. By now, you might be wondering, how does this happen? How do good, smart, even kind-hearted people fall into the machinery of functional stupidity? To answer that, we have to shift the lens from morality to psychology. Because Bonhoeffer's insight wasn't just spiritual, it was also deeply psychological. And decades later, science caught up. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted what would become one of the most famous conformity experiments in history. Participants were asked to compare the length of lines on cards. The task was simple. But what the test subjects didn't know was that the other participants in the room were actors planted to give wrong answers. And what happened? Over 75% of the real participants gave the obviously wrong answer at least once just to match the group. Not because they believed it, but because standing out felt worse than being wrong. Now take that instinct, multiply it by millions, and you begin to understand what Bonhoeffer was facing. He wasn't just fighting against propaganda. He was fighting against the social fear of standing alone. We are tribal creatures. We've evolved to survive in groups. And when that group moves in one direction, no matter how absurd, it feels safer to follow than to think. Especially when thinking puts a target on your back. But here's the twist: Bonhoeffer believed that it wasn't stupidity that causes this behavior. It was pressure. Structural, systemic, unrelenting pressure. The kind that makes independent thought not just risky, but exhausting. Imagine this: you're a citizen in Nazi Germany. You disagree with what's happening, but you've got a family to feed. Neighbors are being reported. Jobs are vanishing. Your pastor is quoting the Reich. Your friends are silent. Your boss is watching. What do? You compromise. You rationalize. You tell yourself it's just temporary. You say things like, this isn't my fight, or I'm just trying to get by. And little by little you stop thinking critically, not because you're stupid, but because thinking has become dangerous, costly, lonely. Bonhoeffer saw this happen to his own friends, intellectuals, clergy, men and women who had debated philosophy with him over coffee just years before, now parroting party lines justifying genocide, shaming dissent. But he also saw something else. The cost of resisting was enormous, but the cost of surrendering was higher. Because when you give up your ability to think, you give up your humanity. You become, in his words, a puppet, Not evil, just empty. That's what he feared most, not the tyrants, but the silent majority. The people who looked the other way, who nodded along, who stopped asking questions because the answers were too uncomfortable. That he believed was the real threat to civilization. And today, we may not be in 1940s Germany, but the mechanisms are still alive. The pressure to conform, the algorithms that feed us only what we want to hear, the slogans that drown out thought, the comfort of consensus over the courage of conviction. Bonhoeffer would argue it's not enough to not be evil. You have to be awake. You have to be curious. You have to be willing to feel the discomfort of thinking when the crowd has stopped. Because stupidity isn't born, it's invited. It's welcomed into our minds every time we choose comfort over clarity, ease over inquiry, slogans over substance. So ask yourself, when was the last time you stood alone in your thinking? When was the last time you held a belief up to the light and tested it? Not against your feelings, but against the facts. Because if we're not doing that, we're not resisting. We're just surrendering one convenient thought at a time. Bonhoeffer's brilliance wasn't just in what he observed, it was in how eerily his words still echo through our digital lives. He saw stupidity not as a failure of intellect, but as a collapse of independence. And what was once caused by crowds in the town square is now magnified by crowds online. Today, stupidity is scalable. It's engineered, not just tolerated but monetized. And the marketplace, social media. Think about it. You open your phone and scroll. You see headlines that confirm your beliefs, content that enrages you just enough to share, and posts from friends repeating phrases they didn't write. That's not coincidence. That's architecture. That's how the system is built. Bonhoeffer warned of a time when people would no longer recognize themselves in their own thoughts, when they would become vessels, not thinkers. And that time, it's now. Algorithms know what you fear, what you hate, what you crave. And they feed it to you over and over until critical thought feels like betrayal. In 2018, a study from MIT found that false information spreads 6 times faster than the truth on Twitter. Why? Because lies are designed to feel good. They're simple, satisfying, shareable. And the truth? It's slow, complex, uncomfortable. In a world of emotional immediacy, truth doesn't stand a chance unless we fight for it. And fighting for it means slowing down, thinking, verifying, asking ourselves, who wrote this? Why do I believe this? Who benefits if I don't question it? Bonhoeffer called this resistance costly grace, because it demands something from us. Time, attention, discomfort. It's so much easier to scroll, to react, to belong. But the minute we stop thinking, we stop choosing. And when we stop choosing, we start complying. Compliance is the soil where stupidity grows best. It doesn't need hate. It needs habit. 1,000 small moments where we chose ease over effort, where we outsourced our thinking to the crowd. Let's be honest, we've all done it. Shared a meme without checking it. Quoted a statistic we never looked up. Nodded along to something because it came from someone we like. It doesn't make us bad, it makes us human. But staying human means noticing when we're slipping. So here's a challenge. Before you share something online, take 60 seconds, just 1 minute. Ask, is this true? Do I know it's true? Who does this serve? That minute might feel like nothing, but multiplied by millions, it could be everything. Bonhoeffer believed that one thinking person could disrupt the chain. That one mind awake in a room full of echoes could shift the air. And maybe you're that person. Not the loudest, not the smartest, but the one willing to pause, to resist the reflex, to think. Because in the age of engineered stupidity, thinking is rebellion. Silence isn't neutrality, it's surrender. And attention. That's your weapon. Bonhoeffer didn't just warn us, he handed us the map. The question is, are we brave enough to follow it? Bonhoeffer's theory takes a darker turn when you realize it wasn't just about isolated individuals losing their way, it was about entire systems designed to keep them lost. And what's worse, those systems don't need to suppress the truth. They just need to make truth inconvenient. Picture this, you're exhausted. You've worked 2 jobs this week, your rent's due, you haven't really slept. You open your phone, and there it is, another piece of news, another crisis, another issue you're supposed to care about. But you don't have the energy to care. Not today. So you scroll. You click what's familiar. You share what feels right. Not what is right, what feels right. This is what economists call rational ignorance. It's not stupidity in the traditional sense, it's a survival tactic. When the cost of being informed is too high, people logically choose to stay uninformed, not because they're lazy, but because their mental bandwidth is maxed out. And this is where modern society becomes dangerous. Because our systems, economic, political, technological, are structured to reward shortcuts. Emotional reactions over critical thinking, slogans over substance, outrage over nuance. The media runs on attention, outrage grabs it. Social media runs on engagement, anger drives it. Politicians run on votes, fear secures them. And you're in the middle, tired, overwhelmed, constantly nudged toward the path of least resistance. Bonhoeffer understood this long before we had a name for it. He saw it in the quiet obedience of the German middle class, in the way the intellectual elite started parroting propaganda. Not because they were coerced, but because resisting required a stamina most had lost. He knew that evil doesn't always show up in a villain's uniform. Sometimes it walks in wearing exhaustion, apathy, willingness to just get by. And what's terrifying is how many of us are there right now. When your life is a constant loop of work, stress, noise, and distraction, where is the space for contemplation, for doubt, for truth? That's why Bonhoeffer wrote that stupidity isn't just about individuals. It's systemic, it's social. It grows in environments where thinking is punished and repetition is rewarded. Let me give you an example. Think about your social feed. When was the last time you were rewarded for asking a difficult question, for sharing a thoughtful, balanced perspective? It's rare. Because nuance doesn't trend. Certainty does. Simplicity does. Rage does. Bonhoeffer wouldn't be surprised. He warned us once thinking becomes a liability, stupidity becomes the default. Once truth becomes inconvenient, people stop seeking it. But there's another layer. And this one's even harder to admit. We like being certain. We like feeling right. It soothes the chaos, gives us identity. And that's why we cling to beliefs even when they're wrong. Because the alternative, uncertainty, humility, rethinking, is terrifying. But if we don't face that terror, we become part of the machine Bonhoeffer feared. Not evil, just passive, just compliant, just comfortably numb. And that's why reclaiming our minds isn't just noble. It's necessary. It starts small, reading before reposting, asking before assuming, resting before reacting, thinking before believing. Because if we don't pause, the system keeps moving. And it doesn't need your permission to shape you, just your silence. But there's something even more disturbing beneath the surface of Bonhoeffer's theory. It's not just that our systems exploit functional stupidity. It's that our brains are wired to go along with it. And once you understand how our minds really work, the urgency of his warning becomes inescapable. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced the concept of cognitive dissonance, the tension that arises when we hold two conflicting beliefs. When people encounter information that challenges what they already believe, the brain doesn't calmly weigh the evidence. It panics, it fights, it rewrites. We are not logical creatures. We are storytelling creatures. And the first person we lie to is ourselves. Bonhoeffer grasped this before neuroscience confirmed it. He wrote, "It becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem but a sociological one. But even deeper than that, it's biological. Our brains crave coherence, certainty, simplicity. And when those are threatened, we defend them like our lives depend on it, because once they did, thousands of years ago, hesitation got you killed." The human brain evolved to make fast emotional decisions because back then, the tiger didn't wait for nuance. But now, in the age of information, that same brain makes us vulnerable to manipulation. We trust what feels familiar. We reject what feels complex. And so we scroll, and click, and react. Think of how many times you've read something that contradicted your beliefs, and instantly felt that gut-level resistance, not just disagreement, but discomfort. That's cognitive dissonance in action. And most of us don't lean into that tension. We escape it. We change the channel. We click another link. We go back to the safety of certainty. That's how functional stupidity spreads, not just because we're tired, but because we're wired to avoid discomfort. And when you combine that with economic stress, social pressure, and algorithmic design, you get the perfect storm. You get people with degrees and good intentions sharing nonsense. You get professionals who know better going silent out of fear. You get an entire population outsourcing their critical thinking to influencers, ideologues, and artificial intelligence. Bonhoeffer didn't have access to brain scans or big data. But he saw it clearly: when thinking becomes painful, people stop doing it. And when enough people stop, the consequences aren't intellectual, they're existential. That's why this theory is more than just an academic insight. It's a survival manual. Because in an age where your brain is being hijacked for profit and power, the only defense left is awareness. The ability to pause, to reflect, to question even your own mind. So how do we resist? We start by accepting the truth: we're all vulnerable. Intelligence is not immunity. Education is not armor. Every one of us is susceptible to the comforting lie and the seductive certainty. But vulnerability is not weakness. It's the starting point of wisdom. When we acknowledge how easily we can be fooled, we begin to see clearly. We begin to think deliberately. We begin to break the cycle. Because the future doesn't belong to the smartest. It belongs to the most aware. Bonhoeffer's theory wasn't meant to make us feel superior. It was meant to wake us up. To remind us that our minds are worth defending, not just from others, but from ourselves. And the question isn't, are we smart enough? The question is, are we willing to stay awake even when dreaming feels easier? Let's take a moment to breathe, because where this theory leads next is even heavier. Bonhoeffer didn't just warn us about the mechanisms of stupidity. He warned us about the moment it becomes unstoppable. The point where societies aren't just deceived, they're complicit. He described it not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow moral erosion. A cultural numbness. A place where people stop distinguishing right from wrong because the effort to do so no longer feels worth it. And the most terrifying part, it always feels normal at the time. This is how the Salem witch trials happened. How apartheid sustained itself. How the Holocaust unfolded in broad daylight. Not because millions of people turned into monsters, but because millions of people chose comfort over courage. Familiarity over friction. Loyalty over logic. We like to think we'd be the exception, that we'd speak up, that we'd resist. But Bonhoeffer knew better. He saw how quickly people adapted to injustice, how they normalized cruelty, explained away absurdity, excused violence as policy. Functional stupidity isn't about knowing less, it's about feeling less responsible, less engaged, less disturbed. And when you feel less, you do less. But that silence, it's not neutral. It's a vote. Every time we look away, every time we shrug, every time we say it's not my problem, that's how it grows. Bonhoeffer wrote from a cell awaiting death, not just because he resisted evil, but because he refused to be quiet. His silence was selective, strategic. He knew when to hold his tongue and when to roar. And maybe that's the balance we've lost today. We're so overwhelmed with noise that we confuse reaction with resistance. But Bonhoeffer's defiance wasn't about shouting, it was about clarity. About choosing his words and his silence with precision. He asked who stands fast, not who yells the loudest. Not who has the best comeback. But who stands calm, conscious, anchored when the tide is pulling everyone the other way. So ask yourself, what's the last thing you let slide? Not because you agreed with it, but because challenging it felt like too much work. What's the last lie you let pass because correcting it felt like conflict? This isn't a call to be combative. It's a call to be awake. Awake to the patterns, to the decay, to the ease with which silence becomes surrender. And here's the thing Bonhoeffer understood better than anyone. True resistance starts not with protest, but with perception. With the ability to see the storm forming before it arrives. Because by the time you're in it, it's already too late to prepare. The time to resist the tide is when your feet still touch the ground. This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about the soul of a culture. About whether we're willing to feel again, think again, care again. And if we are, then maybe, just maybe, we still have time to stand fast. While it still means something. So, where do we go from here? If stupidity isn't just ignorance but a force shaped by fear, fatigue, and design, what do we do with that knowledge? For Bonhoeffer, the answer wasn't retreat. It wasn't cynicism. It was what he called costly grace. And grace in this context isn't just spiritual, it's intellectual, emotional, cultural. Costly grace means choosing to think when it would be easier to coast. Choosing to speak when silence is more comfortable. Choosing to see when everyone else is averting their eyes. Bonhoeffer lived it. He didn't just write essays. He joined the resistance, helped Jews escape, plotted against Hitler. He didn't just observe stupidity, he risked everything to stand against it. And in doing so, he showed us what resistance really looks like: quiet, steady, costly. We live in a time when it's never been easier to know everything, and never been easier to understand nothing. We're drowning in content yet starved for clarity. And in this flood of noise, the temptation is to give up, to numb out, to choose the convenience of conformity over the discipline of discernment. But we don't have to. We can start small. Not with massive protests or viral rants, but with internal acts of rebellion. Like questioning what we repost. Like choosing not to react immediately. Like asking ourselves, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm missing something? Because that's the seed of wisdom, doubt, not arrogance. Curiosity, not certainty. Bonhoeffer's most haunting insight wasn't that stupidity was dangerous. It was that it felt righteous. That it could disguise itself as loyalty, morality, patriotism. And that's what makes it so seductive. So the challenge isn't just to avoid stupidity, it's to recognize when we're in its orbit. To feel the pull of tribal thinking, of emotional shortcuts, and still choose the harder path to think. Because when you do that, even just once, you fracture the cycle. You send a ripple into the system. And someone else might pause, might think, might choose. This isn't theory, it's practice. It's the practice of building a life that resists intellectual surrender. A life that stands even when standing is quiet, lonely, and unnoticed. And if that feels daunting, remember this: Bonhoeffer didn't know if he'd make a difference. He wrote from a prison cell knowing he might die. And still he wrote. Still he thought. Still he believed. Because even when everything is against you, choosing to think is a form of defiance. A declaration: I will not be moved by noise. I will not be owned by fear. I will not surrender my mind. So start there. Start small. Start now. Because the tide is rising, and we need more people who are willing to stand before it crashes. Bonhoeffer once asked the question that still echoes through every society teetering on the edge of moral collapse. Who stands fast? Not just who speaks up, but who remains standing when the pressure builds, when thinking is punished, when silence is rewarded. It's a question not of intelligence, but of resolve. Not of brilliance, but of backbone. Because the truth is, the modern world doesn't need more clever people. It needs more brave ones. People willing to resist not with rage, but with resilience, with clarity, with consistency. The kind of resistance that doesn't always make headlines, but shifts history nonetheless. Think of all the moments in your own life when staying quiet felt easier. At work, when a colleague spread falsehoods. Online, when a friend posted something dangerously wrong. In your family, when someone justified hate as tradition. Those are the moments Bonhoeffer was talking about. Not the grand gestures, but the daily choices. The private crossroads. The decision to think clearly, speak carefully, and act justly. We often believe resistance has to be loud. Bonhoeffer believed otherwise. He believed that resistance, real resistance, often looks like quiet faithfulness. A mind that won't be shaped by lies. A heart that won't be seduced by slogans. A soul that knows truth, even when truth costs everything. He wrote, the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. And if that's the standard, we're not just failing, we're surrendering. But it's not too late. It's not too late to start building the intellectual muscle we've let atrophy. To start questioning with compassion instead of condemning with certainty. To start choosing humility over performance, complexity over comfort. We need to teach our children not what to think, but how to think. How to ask the second question. How to stand still in the storm of misinformation and say, I will wait, I will check, I will think. Because that pause, that breath, that moment of critical thought is rebellion in an age of reaction. And it's how we slowly, patiently build a culture that values thinking again. Bonhoeffer's death was a tragedy. But his life, that was a blueprint. A manual for those of us still here, still watching the world drift, still hoping it can be pulled back. So who stands fast? Maybe it's you. Not with armor or applause, but with discipline. With a quiet mind. With a refusal to surrender your humanity to the algorithm, to the mob, or to the lazy comfort of certainty. Because what Bonhoeffer knew, and what we must remember, is that the war for our world is not being fought on battlefields. It's being fought in classrooms, in living rooms, in feeds and forums and hearts. And the greatest weapon you have isn't louder opinions, it's a quieter, stronger will to think for yourself. So if this is the war Bonhoeffer saw coming, fought not with bombs, but with beliefs, then what's left for us to do? What can one person really change in a world wired for intellectual surrender? The answer is simple but not easy: begin again. Each day, begin again. Begin by choosing awareness over autopilot. Begin by asking better questions even when the answers are slow or painful. Begin by listening not to echo chambers, but to people who think differently than you, who challenge you, who unsettle you in a way that sharpens, not shatters. And in that discomfort, find your anchor. Find the part of yourself that still believes in thoughtfulness, in slowness, in truth, that outlasts trends. Because here's the quiet miracle: Bonhoeffer pointed us towards stupidity may be contagious, but so is courage. Every time you resist a reflex, you make space for someone else to do the same. Every time you ask, instead of assume, pause, instead of post-reflect, instead of react, you give others permission to wake up, to stand fast, to think. And isn't that the most radical act in the world today, to think not for content, not for applause, not to win, but to understand? To think as a way of loving the world. Because Bonhoeffer didn't think his way into safety. He thought his way into sacrifice, into truth. And it cost him everything but gave us a compass, a way through. So let that be your inheritance. Not fear, not fatigue, but clarity. A commitment to never surrender the one thing no one can take from you, your mind. And if you've listened this far, I want to thank you. You didn't take the easy path. You stayed. You thought. You chose discomfort over distraction. And that's rare. That's powerful. If this resonated, if it stirred something in you, share it. Not because it's viral, but because it's vital. The fight against stupidity isn't glamorous, but it is essential. And every mind awakened is one more light in the dark. So subscribe if you haven't. Not for me, for you. For the discipline of returning again and again to places that ask more of you. To content that doesn't flatter but challenges. That doesn't distract but directs. Because in a world designed to steal your focus, reclaiming it isn't just survival, it's revolution. Stand fast, stay awake, keep thinking. This is how we begin again.